Hello, I'm Communications Officer Nia Douglas, and thank you for joining us for this very special GIS report, where we'll be discussing the Jury Bill 2022 and hoping to get some feedback from the public on this very important bill. I'm going to allow my guests to introduce themselves for today.
Hi, hello everyone. I am Fareen Vanderpool-Nibs, Registrar of the High Court. Thank you for having me.
My name is Tiffany R. Scatliff. I am the Director of Public Prosecutions. Thank you for having me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Oliver Mackenzie Agard, and I'm Security and Justice Policy Advisor within the Office of the Deputy Governor.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Let's start with what is the Jury Bill 2022 and why is it important?
The Jury Bill 2022 is a new piece of legislation. It seeks to modernize and enhance the jury system in the Virgin Islands. Why it's important? Mainly because our current Jury Act is outdated. It's a 1914 Act. And we've also had numerous challenges to that Jury Act. There's at least one instance where a portion of the legislation was struck down for unconstitutionality.
Serious issues, meaning, could you expand upon that? You're saying it was unconstitutional. Can you give me another example?
I think the DPP would be more inclined to give us practical examples of what has been happening in the courts.
Okay.
The Jury Bill 2022 is an essential piece of legislation. To go back to the history, the current Jury Act was passed in 1914. Of course, things were a lot different then in the BVI. And we started the process under the Law Reform Commission in 2009 to get a new jury bill that better facilitated the criminal justice process. The main difficulty we have with the current Jury Act is the limited size of what we call the jury pool or the jury array, which is more or less the group of persons you will select those 9 jurors from. Some of the problems we've been facing are, for example, we are a small territory, about 35 to 38,000 people. Right now, how things are, even though the current legislation allows it to be broad, it's limited to just persons who can vote. Not every BVI lander who is a citizen of Balanga has exercised or decided to register to vote, so you're leaving them off. There are other people who are part of the society for a number of years. They contribute. It is important to them. Most people don't understand. Juries are supposed to be representative of the community at large. And what has happened in the past is that you will have a jury array selecting, and when you read up half the names of the persons on the indictment, meaning the witnesses, the accused, persons will get up and say, I'm related to this person, I know this person. So that cuts down about 50% of the persons in the room. Then, of course, there are persons who cannot come because of their jobs, who have other difficulties, who have been already excused prior, because there is a process where if you're not available, the court can excuse you. So it brings us down to a very limited jury pool, or limited amount of people to select your juries from. Now, the unconstitutionality part that Ms. Agard was referring to, unfortunately, in 2018, there was a Court of Appeal judgment, the Queen versus Alcido Tyson, which more or less criticized the Crown's right to standby. Now, most people don't understand what standby was for or is, but standby was when the Crown was able to sit down as juror and say, we stand by, or just say, have this person excused. Because we have information about that person, they may be conflicted, because the reality is not every person on the jury is very forthright in saying this I am related to this person, or
When you
those
say
things.
crown, can you be clear?
The crown is the prosecution in this particular case. The crown also sometimes refers to the entire government system. However, when I'm speaking about the crown as the prosecution, when I'm talking about, I'll just to make everything clear, to say prosecution. The prosecution has the right to excuse jurors for different matters. For example, previously, the wives of police officers or the spouses of police officers were not exempt. And sometimes you will have police officer spouses in that jury pool. And just to make sure everything appears to be fair, you have to excuse them. We have local attorneys, including myself. And on more than one occasion, I have to stand by members of the jury pool who are related to me. It's not that they couldn't do a good job, but it's the appearance of fairness in a criminal trial that is essential. So we're trying to have it expanded. Now, there's a lot of concern about the expansion. Please note, in the original Jury Act that we have now, you are eligible to be a juror if you're ordinarily resident in the territory for 10 years, that you are a citizen or belonger, and that you don't have any criminal convictions, or a member of House of Assembly, at the time Legislative Council, or certain government posts. That is not changed in this act. What it is, it actually modernized the language to make it more clear and to make sure people understand what is qualified. Because we also had another judgment, that's in 2009, I believe, of William Penn versus the Queen, where the selection process of the jury was criticized by the Privy Council. In that particular matter, it was criticized that you were only using the voters list to pull jurors, which means you left a large cross-section out of the process. And that's not fair to the defendant, to the prosecution, or even to the public, because when you are being tried for a criminal offense, you are to be judged by a jury of your peers. What does that mean? That means you have to be judged by the people in your society who you live with every day. And we have a very large demographic. It's not how it was in 1914. It was just persons from the Virgin Islands. We have a lot of different people who have come here, lived amongst us, and are part of our society. We need to make sure that they are all included in this process. It's also a part of your civic duty as being part of the community. If you don't vote, you should be on a jury.
So essentially what you're saying is in the original legislation, which was from 1914, that the jury pool was so limited that it affected the right to a fair trial by your peers, because it was not everybody's peers was represented. So there was a need to diversify it.
I wouldn't go that far. Okay. My thing is, you need to make sure you have a large cross section. We've never had a challenge so far. We've had what I consider to be fair jurors.
Okay.
However, the problem is when you're selecting, it can limit the process. It can frustrate the process. It can make defendants feel that they're not getting a full, because if you have everybody come up and says, I know this person, or I'm related to this witness, I'm related to this police officer, I know this person, it makes the process not look as transparent as it needs to be. There is transparency, I want to make that very clear. But by broadening the jury pool to make it more inclusive of more people in the society, you have a better chance of having a proper cross-section of the community in the process and being part of the jury process and determining the innocence or guilt of a person.
So this will make it easier,
It will make
essentially,
it easier.
to do that process of
Yes.
selecting pairs.
Yes.
Okay, so can we talked about expanding the jury pool. Can you tell me specifically ways in which this bill provides for a wider spread?
Well, it properly mandates now, because what was happening prior, persons were only limiting jurors based on the voters list, because that was the only information they had to pull. By having this bill, we are seeking information from the Social Security Board, Department of Immigration, the Civil Registry, so we can get a full list of all persons in the territory. Because as I stated before, not every citizen or belonger has registered to vote. They may not want to, or they probably never got around to it, but just by limiting it to voters list, you're leaving a large amount of the population out.
So to add to what Madam DPP has said, under the bill, Jury Bill 2022, to qualify as a voter, you can either be a belonger, either have been granted a certificate of residency under the Immigration Act through the Immigration Department, ordinarily resident in the territory for at least 10 years, but also persons that are registered to vote. Having said that, there is one important eligibility criteria. You must be at least 18 years, but not more than 70 years. So that has widened the jury pool.
And previously it was 18 to 60.
18 to 60 years.
And so why? So by raising it to 70, presumably that would give us more. Was
Additional
62
persons.
restrictive prior? Did you find?
Yes, and from the examples DPP has given. So the old criteria obviously posed problems in the practicality of the application of the legislation. So there were different means by which the legislator sought to expand the jury pool, and expanding the age eligibility criteria would assist in expanding that pool.
Okay, so for some persons who may think 70 is too old, so people of that age typically have problems, health problems or otherwise, or difficulty. There is, I understand, provisions in the legislation that allows for if someone is not mentally or physically capable to be exempted. That's correct, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So even if a person is 70 and he or she is capable, then they will be called upon. But if they're not, so we're not having jurors who are 70 years old with health problems serving on the jury, correct?
No, we're not. But likewise, we wouldn't have a 20-year-old who is physically or mentally incapable of serving as a juror, serve as a juror. So it applies both ways.
Persons who are older are just as able and willing to serve the community, and we need to stop this narrative of saying that people are old, because we're all going to get old at one point, because there are 70-year-old persons who are more agile, more physically fit, more mentally capable than a 20-year-old. So why are we leaving them out? They have lived life. Because one of the things a judge will tell you when he's summing up to a jury, he will say, you have to use and pull from your life experiences. You're not going to get life experiences at 20 years old. You're going to get it at 60, 70, those age groups. So once they're able and you are capable, you have the mental capacity and the physical capacity, why should you be left out?
So if I could just weigh in, both speakers have very eloquently laid out the primary changes in the new bill. And as you, moderator, mentioned, the bill we've been working on has been the original jury bill in the BVI. And this amended bill, the 2022 Act, now to be passed, will in fact improve upon that in some very significant ways. The biggest way would be the diversification of the jury pool list. And so by laying it out, as my colleagues have mentioned, it is now clear that the drawing of that jury list, the compilation, wouldn't just be limited to that one resource that has been heavily relied on, being the electoral list, which has been the main list that captures the broad population. And because that has been convenient, a lot of the time the jury list came from that pool mostly, not only, but mostly. And as has been mentioned, that has been criticized. So by laying things out where we expand the age upward, spell out the different quarters of this community that will now comprise the jurors list, we are saying that the effort has been to widen and diversify that jurors list so that there can be a proper representation of the community when persons are drawn down on individual juror panels. And that has been a significant change that's needed at this time in our community.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, I am aware that there are exemptions and disqualifications that have been altered in the Act. So could you tell me why? What are some of the reasons for those alterations?
In relation to exemptions, so there may be some persons who, by the very nature of their job or the exigencies of their services, for example, essential services, those persons are exempted from serving on the jury. So, for example, police officers, prison officers, lawyers, counsel in DPP chambers, those persons are, for obvious reasons, exempted. There are some additions to the exemption list, but those are posts that were not there in 1914. For example, you may notice internal audit, the director for those particular posts, they may be exempted. We didn't have those posts in 1914, but those are now included in the exemption list.
And tell me about the fees. I know there have been provisions made for fees. So can you expand on that for me?
So there's the jury rules of 1973. That's our current rules. The fees for jurors are laid out in those rules. Essentially, a juror is entitled to $20 per day or for part of the day, whatever is served. In addition to that, there's a subsistence allowance depending upon where the juror is coming from. If it's a mile from the court, then they're entitled to that allowance as well.
And so are these fees designed to benefit the public?
Yes, it's designed to benefit every juror. As long as you're serving, you've been called to serve, and you're serving, you're entitled to these fees.
And were these existent prior in the original legislation?
Yes, it's in the jury rules of 1973, which I believe will be looked at after the 2022 bill is passed. Then the rules will be looked at, and more than likely those fees will be increased because, as I said, it's 1973.
Okay. So lastly, I would like us to talk about how this compares to other jurisdictions. This bill, we've said multiple times, it's designed to modernize the legislation. So for persons who don't really understand why it needs to be modernized or how we compare relative to the rest of the world, could we just expand upon how this bill is going to bring us to a contemporary Virgin Islands?
Let me step back a bit to answer the first portion of what you said. The bill really went through a law reform process. Law reform becomes necessary where there are societal changes. From 1914 to 2022, obviously the Virgin Islands have changed quite a bit. So the reformation of the Jury Act is imperative. That's the first thing. Of course, what the legislators in 1914 and the drafters would have been looking at to put in place then is different now. And the DPP explains some of that, how the Virgin Islands has changed, the demographics, the population, etc. Because of that, this bill must be changed. And of course, the challenges as well, right? Having said that, to answer the latter part of your question, I think my previous answer somewhat answers that as well. Because of these changes, it's imperative to modernize it.
Do you guys want to weigh in on that?
Well, one thing that persons need to understand, people like to compare the BVI to America or the United Kingdom. Please stop doing that. We are a very small jurisdiction. You have to remember the United Kingdom and United States have millions of people. So therefore, they can restrict their jurors to those persons who can just vote, as I think it is in the United Kingdom. We can't do that here because we don't have that much of a population. And as I described before, what problems that can cause. We need to be open and understanding to know that persons who have lived here for over 10 years, they have no convictions, they have contributed to society, have a right to be a part of the process. So that's one of the things that we're hoping to be more inclusive. And I think that's different to other jurisdictions because one, of our size, and two, as I explained, our demographic.
But other than the sizing, our Jury Act bill at the moment, soon to be act, very much mirrors what other jurisdictions would have in terms of provisions, chapters, provisions generally in the law of this kind. The jury, as a feature of the criminal justice system in common law countries, the jury serves a particular function in criminal trials at the High Court. And all countries that observe a similar structure would have a jury act. So that's the first thing. We're not unique in having a jury act. What's prescribed here, some of the detailing as to who is qualified, who's exempted, would be informed by what has happened in recent years, the challenges that has come, what the practitioners deal with on a regular basis in all courts, separate to courts in any other jurisdiction. So the bill itself is a response to all reality, but it also equals what happens in other common law jurisdictions with respect to setting up a jury structure, ensuring its place within a criminal trial, and informing what that jury does in a criminal trial, which is now a big part of even our constitutional rights on the ground here, having a trial by jury. So what we have presented and what will be going to the House of Assembly is a modern jury bill that reflects our reality and also is comparable in substance to other jury bills throughout the Commonwealth.
So the bill is supposed to modernize the legislation, but with respect to the way that the Virgin Islands is today. So rather than just trying to be like other jurisdictions who do not match our reality and parameters, we're making it suit what the Virgin Islands is today.
Yes.
That's
correct.
And
Excellent.
another example, for example, in this bill, we have moved for what they call alternative jurors. That's something that was non-existent under the 1914 legislation. So, God forbid, during a trial, one of the jurors takes ill or has a family emergency, then you're left with 8. And sometimes that becomes a challenge at the Court of Appeal level. So by having alternative jurors, which is something that is universal across the board in most jurisdictions, if one of those main jurors, those main 9, can no longer proceed, whether they are disqualified for bias or have a family emergency or fall ill, one of those reasons, you have another jury that can step in and you keep a full body of 9.
Excellent. Is there anything else you would like to add or you want the public to know before I encourage them to fill out the survey?
Well, I would just like the public to understand that juries are an integral part of our criminal justice system. It needs to work. A lot of times people criticize the criminal justice system without having a real understanding for it. And what people have to understand is when someone is before the court, the High Court, it's imperative that they have a set of jurors who have the understanding, the impartiality, and are able to have the life experience of living in the BVI to give a fair and right verdict.
Yes. So I would only add to that by saying that we understand that the public would rightly have questions on this piece of legislation, and any questions that weren't properly answered here, certainly we would encourage persons to raise their questions in the right forums to Madam DPP, to myself, just so that there's better understanding of what is happening. Nothing is wrong with asking a question. It's always obviously how you ask your question, but please be informed as much as possible because the jury system is has been said and said again, a very integral part of our criminal justice system. And when persons understand what it's about, having to be summoned later on to do what we call your civic duty to be part of a jury pool, it wouldn't come as a thunder shock to some persons because they understand what it's about, they understand their role. And everybody, quite frankly, if you're before a criminal court, you would want a fair jury to be the ones deliberating on the facts in that exercise. So I encourage the public to participate, to ask your questions, be sure you understand what this is about. And we hope that this bill is soon passed.
Like my colleague, I'll encourage persons to read the bill. While the bill has gone through a reformation process, not everything in the bill is entirely new. may be worthy to compare the current act with the new bill, but also to read it and, as my colleague said, to send in your questions, and we'll be more than willing to answer those questions.
Well, if you're watching or listening and you have comments, questions, thoughts, or concerns about the Jury Bill 2022, there will be a link to a survey on the screen in the caption if you're watching on Facebook. And if not, you can go to bvi.gov.vg to find the link on the web banner. We really want to hear from you. It is important, as my guest said today, for us to give feedback because we're all a part of this system. So we're hoping that you fill out the survey and let us know, even in the comments, if you have any questions or concerns to be a part of this process. Thank you again for watching. Have a good day.